Right, Tom.
Yeah, okay, cheers, Bill. Cheers, Corey. Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this. The first of what we will have is a series of free webinars going forward into spring and summer of next year. So welcome, everybody. I'll move on very briefly. We're joined today by Bill and Corey, my colleagues, who are doing the presentations. And I today will be managing or picking up the points in chat as we go forward. And we do go through it. We have a number of points we're going to stop, have a break as well, because 2.5 hours can be quite a run when you get when we're in the middle of stuff, especially when I got an insight to this yesterday. So I can say it's going to be interesting and informative, and I'm looking forward to it as much as everybody else, I hope. So on the screen now, you'll see working together. Flick it on, Bill. I can't. Please. Thank you. This is the format. This is the collaboration for today, and a little bit of housekeeping, shall we say. I'll just let you read that. And Corey's already told you about the recording being done, which I'll just reiterate. That was a request of a number of people who couldn't make it today. So, yeah.
And also, we will be sending you a copy of the slides.
Yes, that's on the bottom of that one. You will be sent a copy of the slides thereafter. It will also be getting the recording will also go on our new website in a couple of weeks' time, so it'll be available from there as well. So I'll move on to meet the team, so you get a little bit of insight into us. I'll just go BCT, Bill, Corey, Tom. Bill Colley is an educational consultant, former service manager within one of the local authorities, and also trained to do in ADOR, ADOS, and I think DEVO, and is a member of various associations and bodies, and obviously fulfills a role with ADHD out with AISee, with ADHD Coalition in Scotland, and he's Vice President of the ADHD UK. Corey is an educational specialist and focuses on health, well-being, sexual health, relationship type stuff. And I focus predominantly on advocacy and with insight into employability. And we're all focused on training. And we have the various bits and pieces that go with that. And we'll move on to the next one. Keeping it short and succinct. AISee, what it stands for is Advocate, Identify, Solutions, Educate and Empower. I'll let you read that while I go over it. We're accredited training centre and an accredited advocacy centre. We're neurodivergent led with a focus on autism, ADHD and learning disabilities and associated co-occurring conditions, with emphasis on inclusion for informed solutions for better outcomes. We deliver our services with a human rights, person-centred approach encompassed within our code of ethics, standards and principles of professional advocacy, taxonomy of learning and approach, and our Charter of Wellbeing with comprehensive safeguarding policy and procedures, all within our hashtags of CIHA, CPERG, EARL for PCP, which is really about inclusion, collaboration, reflective learning for positive collaborative partnerships. And that's on to the next one. And I think I'm handing over to you now, Bill.
Right, thank you. First of all, can everyone hear me clearly? Yep. Okay, thank you. So the presentation today is we're looking at the role of neurodevelopmental disorders in the criminal justice system and criminality and offending behaviours. We've come to this, we've chosen this as the first webinar because each of us in our different capacities has come across or have come across children, families who are in contact with the criminal justice system. And one of the common denominators is the fact that a lot of them have neurodevelopmental disorders. So the question arises, why are they so overrepresented in the criminal justice system? Why are they so overrepresented in prison populations? And it's not easy. So we're looking at quite a controversial and complex topic. What we're aiming to do is a bit of silo busting in a way, because one of our conclusions is that there are certain barriers in place, which means that it's quite difficult to access justice. And those barriers can be conceptual, they can be structural. We find differences between psychiatry and psychology and the medical model and the social model. And those barriers aren't ultimately very helpful. So a lot of what we're going to consider today is try to find some common ground. Some of it will be contentious, and that is deliberate in a way, which is why we want the presentation to be as interactive as possible. And just on that note, I will not be monitoring messages because my brain can't cope with doing two things at once. I've got Tom and Corey who will be trying to field those messages, and they will hopefully interrupt my presentation to pose awkward and provocative questions to me.
Sorry to interrupt, Bill. That's a good point. We're all neurodivergent. We didn't say that at the start, so bear with us with our raging ADHDs, but we will work together well. And
there will obviously be feedback form at the end. And what we expect, in fact, one of the limitations of doing simply 2.5 hours on this very big and complex topic is we're going to find that there are certain cul-de-sacs. So in the presentation, an issue may arise, and we can't explore it simply because of the pressures of time. So we don't go into a great deal of detail about, for example, autism and offending, not a great deal of detail about ADHD and offending, and why the diagnostic characteristics of those conditions may lead to increased vulnerability. We touch upon those areas, but in each of those cases, they're worth a presentation on their own. So there is no way in 2.5 hours we'll be able to cover everything. So the structure of the presentation is an introduction from me, which looks at which I think is aimed at posing some questions more than anything else. It's certainly not providing definitive answers at all. And that should lead into the rest of the presentation when we start to consider child development and the increased risk of vulnerability caused by neurodevelopmental disorders. And I'll start with some take-home messages because I find it very helpful, particularly in a long meeting, to have some idea of where we're heading to. We'll briefly look at what we understand by the term neurodevelopmental, but there's a certain assumption here that most of those participating today have background knowledge. So I'm not going to go into the diagnostic characteristics of autism, for example, because there's an assumption in a way that you already possess that knowledge. Likewise with ADHD, likewise with Tourette syndrome or whatever. But if you don't have those, if there's an assumption there that is misplaced, then I think what we'll be aiming to do over forthcoming seminars and webinars is to address those issues. So maybe focusing on one particular neurodevelopmental disorder, going through the diagnostic characteristics and so on. But we won't do that today because we just don't have time. We will look at offending behaviours, and once again, there's a lot of work that can be done about trying to break down this the term offending or criminality, because offences occur for different reasons. Some appear to be motiveless, or we're not sure what the motives are. Some are directly linked to the disorders that we're considering, and some indirectly. But once again, we could spend 2.5 hours just looking through the range of offences and trying to make some sense of them. We will touch upon that area. We will look at associative factors, and there's an assumption that everyone is familiar with the critical difference between correlation and causation. So we can talk about, for example, increased vulnerability in families where there's a child and the mother smokes. Now, that is an association. We're not suggesting causation between smoking and challenging or problematic behaviours. Therefore, I'm not going to keep reiterating that point. It's possible, particularly with some of the research that's presented, that people might be offended, might think there's a focus, for example, on mothers and parenting, and that's not the case. I can't qualify everything that's said. I will then briefly go into the current thinking, probably at an academic medical level, about epigenetics, this complex choreography between environmental and genetic factors, which I think provides the conceptual framework which is most fertile for understanding problematic behaviours and criminality, and then a little bit about the pragmatics. And one of the things that we considered yesterday, because Corey will be coming in with a one case study of a young person with autism who found themselves in contact with the criminal justice system, and it occurred to us that there is really merit in having a webinar solely focused on the case studies, because that demonstrates the way pragmatically we can intervene to help. and support young people and their parents and carers. So take-home messages, right? So no one's going to go away today having solved the problem, because when we think about the amount of money that's thrown at the issue of developmental disorders, intellectual impairment, and the criminal justice system, no one across the world has come up with a solution. The Americans have spent billions and continue to spend billions on researching, on looking at practical strategies, but no one can say we've cracked it, we've made significant progress. And when we think in Scotland, to give it the Scottish context, across a range of policy areas, whether it's housing, whether it's substance use, whether it's alcohol addiction, whether it's young offending, all of those policy areas, one of the conclusions that I have come to is that any policy area or any policy that's developed that does not include an element dedicated to mental health and developmental disorders, which are two different things, which overlap, but it is unlikely to succeed. And that means that not only are we likely to be running against into very strong headwinds because we haven't developed the appropriate policy, but it also means that money is going to be spent in an area which may not yield particularly good bangs per buck and taken away from other areas. There's an opportunity cost to getting policy wrong. So it is complex, and what the suggestion or the conclusion might be at the end of this presentation is that because of the complexity, any approaches towards reducing young offending, towards looking at the victims in this area, and the victims are often the perpetrators, because no one wins, no one succeeds. But given it's a complex problem, it's going to require complex solutions, and those solutions are likely to be multimodal. And when we talk about multimodal, that's going to require different professionals working together. So I said at the beginning, there's a bit of silo busting going on here. The frustration is that we don't work together. There's certain incoherence because the barriers in place can be conceptual and structural, and we need to break those down. And then the final point about genetic and environmental factors, I think it's pretty critical to have at least a sympathetic understanding of epigenetics and the way that both environmental and genetic factors can combine to increase vulnerability. So those are the take-home messages, and we'll start. We'll obviously have to define what we mean by neurodevelopmental, and we're talking about atypicality in terms of both the architecture and function of the brain, but also brain development. And what's often missed when you delve into the expertise that is there in psychiatry and psychology, is that third one is often overlooked. And it's pretty critical when you're dealing with young people in their formative years, because where we might talk about a different developmental trajectory or delays in certain aspects of development, for example, socialization, what the assumption might be is, yes, but they catch up later on in life, ignoring the fact that there are legacy issues. So if you, for example, become socially avoidant at the age of 7 because of failed experiences in socializing, then that is a legacy that can last with you for a long time, in fact, your lifetime. So there are lags, there are delays, but we mustn't ignore the legacy of differences in developmental experiences in the early years, because they have a longer term impact. And I'm starting, well, we'll talk about some of that list. Obviously, it's not, there's a lot more that could be added in there. And I would put road traffic accidents as a, another one that ought to be included, given the number of times you sort of wake up in the morning, you switch on the news and you find that 4 teenagers have been killed in a car crash. And it's always the same, isn't it? You can almost work out the background without knowing the full story. So obviously a very high level of interest in homicide, in homicide in different contexts and different cultures. So homicide in America might be those awful shootings that occur, mass shootings that occur. We're going to look very briefly at the Alicia McPhail case, because it throws up some, I think, quite interesting points in terms of how we conceptualize developmental trajectories that are ultimately self-destructive in a way. We won't go into a great deal of detail in terms of violence and aggression, but Corey's has got a very good case study about sexual offences and neurodevelopmental disorders, and that will come as I think a welcome break from me halfway through this presentation. And then we look at things like hacking. Those are one of the first cases I remember was in probably the 1990s of a young man who got himself into awful difficulty because he hacked into the Pentagon system. And it was motiveless because he wasn't going to do anything with the data. But the point was that it was a challenge, and he succeeded in that challenge. And he was about to be extradited to the USA for this awful crime of breaking through their security system. And then almost inevitably, it emerged that he had Asperger's syndrome, as it was called in those days. And it was a motiveless crime, but it happened nevertheless. And I think that's one of the things that we need to consider is the idea of mens rea, of the criminal intent, the criminal mind, whether the crime there is something very specific and deliberate about the crime, or whether it is directly linked to the developmental disorder that we're talking about. In terms of, we will look briefly at autism spectrum. We'll look at briefly at ADHD, because some of my colleagues on UCAP, the UK ADHD partnership, were actually in London in police stations and interview rooms at the time of the London riots. And what struck them was the vulnerability of a lot of those people who were being brought in and charged, was their vulnerability in terms of speech and language impairment, in terms of ADHD characteristics, and the way that they interacted with the interviewing officers increased vulnerability in terms of their suggestibility, the fact that they would often admit to offences or being present when in fact they hadn't been, and the motive was simply to get out of the police station as quickly as possible. So there's a lot that we need to consider. But in terms of the Alicia McPhail case, this was, if you remember, a very young girl who was on holiday, I think, on one of the islands, Butte or something like that, and she was abducted, raped, and murdered. And it's not just the case itself that was interesting, but the response to the case, because one of the psychiatrists involved was Dr. John Marshall, who was working at Carstairs in the secure estate. And he suggested, after the case had been settled, and after the sentencing had taken place, he suggested that we should be looking for certain behavioral character traits early on in children's lives in order that we can identify potential criminals, if you like, in this case, criminality to an extreme in terms of murder. But there was a huge backlash because he was accused by the tabloid press of encouraging primary school teachers to look for psychopaths in the playground, quote. And it really illustrated perhaps a divide between those who are looking constructively at formulating solutions or interventions at work, and those who perhaps have a more punitive approach. They think that punishment is going to, in some way, prevent a case like this occurring. So the Daily Mail was very critical, and the explanation from John Marshall was that genetic factors are important, temperament is important. I think we're not paying enough attention to those factors. And then this what I think is quite an important positive point, that if we do identify certain behaviour traits early on in life, then it allows certain interventions to take place. And I think in particular, he is looking at callous and unemotional behaviour traits. So what we might label, if we're going down the sort of psychiatry route, as conduct disorder, deliberate cruelty to others, alongside perhaps other characteristics like in terms of in terms of social interaction. So those are bullying and domineering, but actually don't have friends, and are also deliberately cruel at the same time. That would throw up a set of questions about what is there any way we can reshape or redirect the developmental trajectories that these young people might follow. And of course, it's contentious because who is how do you monitor? How do you intervene? What is the legitimacy of the state intervening in the private lives of a family, and so on? And how much responsibility should we attach to primary school teachers or managers who perhaps don't have the training necessary or the confidence, or perhaps the apparatus for communicating concerns in a way that is ultimately constructive rather than destructive? So I expect some feedback back on that. But what I'm suggesting is...
Bill, sorry for cutting across. Can I come in there at this minute in time, if you don't mind, please? Can I raise a point for consideration? Given the last 3 slides, in particular your reference to John Marshall, comments, the considerations there. Does this not strongly suggest that the importance of beyond diagnosis in terms of profiling, or the potential for indicative profiling, for example, like we did in the pilot Informed Solutions for Better Outcomes, where the DOBA was used as DOBA, an assessment tool, was used as a triage tool as opposed to a diagnostic tool, and report provided with a soft advocacy consideration, where we heard from children's panels members that said a report like this would enable us to make better decisions, and a justice team lead in social work said this could be 1,000 times better than what we have at present. Within the system should, and how could this be implemented?
Okay, so I'm going to agree and disagree with you. I'm going to challenge you on that.
Well, that's fine.
But there is obviously a great frustration within particularly the education and care sectors about the clunky nature of our mental health system in terms of assessment, diagnosis, and formulation. That it's quite difficult, and the time delays now, we're talking about 5 years, 7 years, 8 years in one area to get a diagnosis. But I don't think diagnosis is the end result. Diagnosis is only the beginning, because they say once, if you've met one autistic individual, you've met one autistic individual. They're all heterogeneity is the norm within the population. So people with a diagnosis of autism don't all watch Star Trek and collect dinosaurs, and it's patronizing and unhelpful, and in fact obstructive to think in those terms. So diagnosis is, I think it's really important, and it's very, very important for those individuals concerned and their families to have some signposting towards help and support and knowledge and advice that may be out there. But I think there's something else, which is that at a much lower level, it's just I would call it intuition in a way. Having said that, primary school teachers may not have the training necessary, but primary school teachers are human beings, and they're often parents themselves, and they can intuitively identify certain risk factors within a population. And I think I'm coming in at that level to begin with, which is highlighting those behavioral characteristics which ought to be monitored. And I think that's no more than John Marshall was saying. I don't think he was saying, if you've got a child, make sure you put in their file potential psychopath. That's not what it was. What it was saying was that there may be certain behaviors that are developmentally inappropriate. For example, you might find children who bite at the age of 3 and 4. And as you'll see from a piece of research coming up, that individuals are at their most violent between the ages of 3 and 5, surprisingly. They can't do very much with that violence because they don't use weapons, and they're not in situations where it can do very significant harm generally. But the idea that we become more violent as we get older, particularly in teenage years, isn't really reflective. That's not the normal developmental trajectory. But if you find you've got an 8-year-old who bites, I think that's quite a significant marker. And there are a number of other markers that there might be. But I think it's perhaps giving not just the confidence to teachers and professionals who are working with young people to identify those difficult behaviours or problematic behaviours, but also have the means of taking them forward in some way, in a constructive and non-judgmental way.
I'm going to interrupt you there, Bill, as a former primary school teacher, and say, yes, there needs to be some sort of formal, because it can't be, and this is certainly what I experienced, where someone would say, listen, there's someone in your class that we're concerned about because of some of these behaviours. And I was just supposed to go, okay. And there was no, there was no way to build a profile of a person.
When I worked in authority, one of the most positive aspects of working in authority was the relationship we had with the lead clinician at CALMS at the time, whereby I could phone up and say, look, there's a child aged 5 who is a sexual predator, and he's come into our school, and the head teacher is in tears, and they haven't got the level of support that. And I was able to have that conversation, and that lead clinician instantly, because I didn't overplay the card. Many of the problems that we were facing, challenges we were facing, it was up to us to deal with them. But there'll be some cases where it went beyond us, and we needed a collaborative working relationship. And at the time, we had that, a very good dialogue, and we were able to and that meant that you could bring together your education professionals, your social care professionals, and your clinicians, and have a very respectful conversation with them. And I fear that currently, in the last period of time, because of cutbacks in funding, disruption to CALMS, and lack of continuity in CALMS, it's much more difficult to get those collaborative relationships working. And the victims are often those young people who end up starting off down a developmental trajectory, and then the endpoint comes through very significant self-harm or suicide, and some of the other, and criminality, which is what we're discussing today. So going back to the slide, I'm suggesting that the whole nature-nurture schism is overplayed, and we need to be finding common ground, and that means mutual respect, even if our opinions are different. And no doubt we're going to find out, perhaps when we open this up for a bit of this discussion, if the audience, those participating today, agree with this sentiment, or whether they want to challenge it, which is equally healthy. So,
sorry, Bill. A question was asked there by Louise. Why? And I don't know if there's a policy on this or not. Why not screen when we are screened for hearing and eye tests as children?
Well, yes, there's been a lot of discussion about screening for developmental disorders, and the national the NICE policy was that screening, that is where you take the whole population and you screen, is not necessarily appropriate. But what might be more appropriate is to identify certain at-risk groups. So currently in Scotland, it's around about 35% of the school-age population has some form of additional support need. You can break that down further. It's one of the pieces of work I did in authority, was to try to classify, just to get some understanding of what's the number within my population of 19,000 school children. How many would I identify as high risk? And I came up with a figure of about 190 within that population. So we're talking about a very small number, but the first significant step was in identifying them. It's not the number itself necessarily. It's a process by saying, how do we identify this at-risk group, which is also likely to be a high-cost group with respect to the support that's being put into place. And some of these young people were going to end up in secure accommodation at a cost of £300,000 a year. Some were going to end up in residential special schools at a cost of, goodness knows, £100,000. Some would end up in other forms of high-intensity care. And then later in life, I look at some of the characters that I was dealing with, and they are now in adult psychiatric institutions. And I don't beat myself up for saying that we failed them in any way, but it's more to get a handle on this at-risk group. And today we're focusing on offending behaviours, but the other aspects of mental health that obviously should be monitored. So screening may not be the answer, and that would take quite a lot of time. But I think there's some very basic methodologies that could be used to identify at-risk groups. And are there any other? Does anyone else want to make a point at this stage? No. Well, Tom, you'll monitor and come back to me.
I am. I'm going through as we flow. Yes. So sorry, I'll just backtrack. Another point that was made earlier on was about misdiagnosis, and I've just replied to that, and it's a very valid point. Stepson in prison due to being misdiagnosed. We are all misdiagnosed. Are all misdiagnosed and suffered with all the consequences, substance misuse, etc. and fascinated as to why we are not screening, and so on and so forth, which is a valid point. And I've responded to that, just saying that we're forward planning a future webinar on diagnosis and trauma. That might be something we cover in a bit more depth.
Yes, and UCAP are currently working on our next consensus statement is going to be, or what we're trying to come up with is something similar to what is the Coventry grid, which was developed by clinicians to identify, in terms of differential diagnosis, autism from attachment disorders. And what we want to do is look at ADHD and trauma and find out if there's a methodology for separating these out. Because the point that's being made about misdiagnosis, I think, is very valid, and leads to what we get is diagnostic overshadowing, where you get one label being applied, which stops people asking questions about anything else that there may be. And for example, attachment disorder is often used, and very often it's not applied by a clinician who has the training to do it, but it's just generally assumed that because a child comes from a disrupted family background, that it is the disruptive family background that has caused the child's difficulties, rather than looking at it in the way that we're going to do now, in terms of some of the complex dynamics that take place. And in fact, many of the children diagnosed with attachment disorder, in fact, have a neurodevelopmental disorder. Not to say that attachment isn't significant. I'm actually arguing quite the opposite today. But and I think the next slide, if I can move on to the next slide, but I take the point about misdiagnosis, and that's certainly a problem. And again, I think those working with children very often have to have the confidence to say, well, okay, he's been given this label of attachment disorder, but something else going on. That applied to me with a girl, a young girl, a 7-year-old that I got involved with at primary school, who had the attachment disorder and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And the latter, fetal alcohol, that was certainly true. Her brain development had been affected by in utero by the mother's consumption of alcohol. But what she also had, when I was able to phone that clinician at CALMS and say, look, I think there's something else going on here, she went for a diagnosis, and she got the diagnosis of ADHD and autism. And the treatment option, which was to address her anxiety, changed her life. It changed her life from being a girl who was uneducatable almost. She became a very biddable, compliant young lady who went through the secondary education system, no violence and aggression whatsoever, in direct contrast with what had been happening in primary school. So that answers another question, the importance of diagnosis, but the importance of getting the right diagnosis. So this is a very interesting study by Richard Tremblay in Montreal, looking at the link between child development and antisocial behaviour, offending behaviour later on in life. And it was looking at this whole developmental trajectory, particularly the trajectory of violence. And you'll see there's a lot of text on there. Don't worry, you're going to get copies of the slide. But we've highlighted some of the associations that they found. It's about having young mums. It's about mums who left school early. It's about mums who smoked. It's about having younger children, low income, coercive parenting. And I am going to qualify all of this right away, because this looks very much focused on mums and attributing blame to mums, which is, we're going in the opposite direction. However, this study was conducted by gaining information from mothers. Most of the fathers were absent. So although it looks very heavily biased against mothers, it was a study which had its own limitations in terms of the information that was gathered, and was in good science, you write that up in the findings. But what I think was very interesting about this study, and you see from the graph, they identified three groups. The 58% of children display at least 58% display violent behaviours. And there's a smaller group that display quite extremely violent behaviours in their early years and persist with that. And then you've got that smaller group at the bottom who don't tend to display violence. And the conclusion of the study, which really was one of those where it really starts you thinking, is that violence is normal and is unlearned. Under normal developmental conditions, the violent tendencies are unlearned rather than learned. And if we think of the optimal nurturing unit, family unit, then something is probably going on within that unit to encourage children to negotiate violent tendencies or to divert violent tendencies towards something else in terms of resolving conflicts, in resolving frustration or whatever it may be. And that's quite a fundamental shift in thinking. Rather than thinking that violence is taught and acquired, thinking that actually we all have the propensity, particularly in our early years, towards violent behavior, but actually we get over that. There's something that's taking place that enables us to get over that. And what I would suggest from the research, a lot of that is to do with the acquisition of language and the efficient use of memory. But by language, we're talking about receptive language skills, expressive language skills, and the third one that I would put in, because it overlaps with the other two, is the development of private speech. That is the way we speak to ourselves, the way we communicate with ourselves, because the way we communicate with ourselves is very significant as a conditioner in terms of our behaviors. So if you're in a stressful situation, if you manage that situation well, it's often through the development of strategy, an internal strategy that allows you to consider the particular stress that you're under. For example, in a road traffic, you come across a road traffic accident or whatever, the way you speak to yourself about how you deal with negotiating out of that situation. And it's a lot about private speech, the internal speech. If you see young children playing around a table, you will often hear them talking, and they're not talking to each other, they're talking to themselves. It's external. And at some point it becomes internalized, and that is an asset. It's a developmental asset. And not all young people have that asset. There's questions about whether those on the autism spectrum, for example, develop internal speech in the way that a typically developing child might do. And if they don't, or they develop it differently, then it may disadvantage them later in life. So in terms of some of the critical factors about offending, it's not simply, and I think most people attending today would not think of this simply about rule adherence, a failure in rule adherence, that people breaking rules, breaking laws. It's much more about the development of empathy or understanding of self, executive and high order thinking, executive functions that we're going to briefly touch on. And I've also provocatively thrown in something there about some of the risks associated when dealing with children who've been traumatized, about revisiting trauma in a way that may be unskilled, because that in itself could be a traumatic experience and has to be dealt with in a highly professional way. And what I would suggest, again, just to illustrate this in terms of ourselves, if we're driving along in a town and we see the sign 20's plenty, why do we take our foot off the accelerator or reduce our speed? And if the answer is because the law says so, then I don't think that's an adult behavior. If it's because you think there are young children around who might run out and you might hit them and damage your car, then again, that's not why we do it. A lot of the ways in which we condition our own behavior is because of empathy. And our empathy, how much training have we all had on the development of empathy, the types of empathy that there might be, and how that empathy develops through the lifespan? Because what I would say as a male is that I became far more empathic when I had children. I think there are certain stages. When I went through school is when I first started fancying girls, because I then realized that probably in order to be successful, I needed to look after my own appearance a bit better than I had been doing up to that point. And that encouraged me to have be a little bit more self-reflective. But then it was getting married, having children. I think your empathy develops to a new level. So you take your foot off the accelerator, not because the science says you have to, but because you're thinking, this is a risky environment. I don't want to harm another child. Now, if there's some difference in cognition in the neuroatypical population, then there may be solutions, or there may be ways around, strategies around helping people to understand why a certain behavior may be regarded as offensive and potentially damaging. And Corey's going to give a very good case study on that. What I found working in special education is that I had a situation where a child clearly wasn't understanding the difference between serious offences and non-serious offences. And what I did was take a whiteboard and I drew a spectrum from not serious to very serious. And very serious had the illustration of a jail above it. And then I asked him to put certain offences on that line. And he did it very badly, particularly the offence of walking up to a girl and touching her breast, which he didn't think was a big deal. Until I pointed out what it meant in terms of the impact on the girl, the impact on parents, the way that society regards that type of behavior. Even if that behavior wasn't sexually motivated, even if it was curiosity rather than sexually motivated, the impact on the victim, but also the way society looks at it, we would place that offence way down towards the jail end of that particular spectrum. Whether it helps or not, I don't know, but it's one of the strategies we might use when we're dealing with an atypical population. So, a question about neurodevelopmental.
Bill, sorry, can I cut across a couple of things that are coming up in the chat there? Is that there's still the presence of the experiences of being shunned by clinicians when you're seeking a diagnosis, the lack of signposting or additional information as to what interventions are or are not in place, where to go for whatever type of support, so on and so forth. And the other one that's flagged up that we identified from parents when we were doing the pilot study a couple of years ago was very clear that there's still the very early indicative identity from traits from nursery age through early years, and again that then that's coming forward further on through primary into secondary, and then potentially into what we're talking about now, the criminal activity or potential criminal activity, in relation to the lack of all these things. So I suppose the big question is, why can't we get them joined up?
Yes, the frustration with I'm on the working group of the Royal College of Psychiatrists for adult ADHD, and what I would say is the clinicians are as frustrated as we are. It's not a case of the medics, and of course when costs are cut, all the associated services, post-diagnostic services, for example, non-treatment services that might be advisable, they're withdrawn. So clinicians end up diagnosing and giving prescriptions, and it's that's not joined up mental, that's not holistic mental health. So it often falls on the third sector to step in. But again, the third sector is treading on eggshells because they don't want to encroach on areas. The third sector don't want to be encroaching on the professional work of others because it causes offence. What I would say, and this is a bit of self-promotion, I suppose, is that if you find this webinar useful but incomplete, and provocative but incomplete, which I would expect, then what we want is indicators about the more specific things. So Corey will do her case study. I think a webinar simply based on case studies, taking different problem areas like sexualized behavior, early violence and aggression, and focusing on those areas, that would make a lot of sense. We don't have time today. We've only got 2.5 hours. And what I think that, having looked at that previous study, like the Tremblay study, I went back to, I contacted Richard Tremblay, and the first thing he said to me, he was surprised that anyone had ever read it, because a lot of these researchers do research and they get it published and that's that. But I asked him the question, have you taken into account the mental health of the parent and whether the mum in particular was under stress, whether she had a diagnosable developmental disorder or mental health problem? And he said no, because it wasn't within the scope of the study. And that becomes it's a limitation on the study. The study is very interesting for throwing up this idea that violence is unlearned rather than learned. But to point the finger at mothers and say it's all the mother's fault, it was not the purpose of the study, and it was not the conclusion of the study. So the question is, do neurodevelopmental disorders influence the normal trajectories of development, normal experiences of development? And I think that all of us, certainly within our team, would say, yes, they must do in some way. If you have a child with autism who doesn't like tactile contact, doesn't like being hugged, then those processes of attunement and attachment are going to take place in a very different way, and not necessarily a negative way, but there are going to be differences in the experience of the child because of their neurodevelopmental disorder, whatever that might be, and that will depend upon the individual characteristics of the child. So that's the first thing. Neurodevelopmental disorders are likely to influence the childhood experiences in the formative years in some way. And that should lead both parents and professionals involved to be thinking, scratching in their heads and thinking, well, what might the deficits be in a particular family situation that we can improve, that we can help. And then to very quickly focus on the idea of mens rea, the idea of criminal intent, the mental state of anybody involved, the importance of assessing that and understanding that, because you'll find that the prisons are full of people who are not evil. They get things wrong. They may be impulsive. They may make poor decisions. Some of their behaviours may be inadvertent. They're apparently motiveless. But there's always going to be a reason, and it's one of the things we need to think about. So again, go back to the 4 teenagers in the car crashes, whatever. What were the processes involved in the driver taking that bend at excessive speed? Was it the need for a thrill? Was it the need for excitement? Was it the need to be accepted by others within the car and the fear of shame if he took his foot off the accelerator rather than pressing down on it? Those are the sort of things we need to consider, particularly in relation to a disorder like ADHD. So
sorry, Bill. I was reading the chat here. But can I go back 2 slides, please? Because I wanted to come in on a point on the 2 points in that on slide 16.
I don't know how to go back.
All right, okay. That was the one 2 slides ago. You had a couple of points up there. Do NDDs interfere with the normal processes of developing, and in so doing increase vulnerability? And the other point was, if so, can external interventions avert later problematic diagnosis? That's the one, yes. Thanks for that. I don't know who did that, but that's the one. On taking both these points together, is our system traumatizing system finds due to lack of inclusion person-centered approaches in respect of a more holistic overview, as well as supportive considerations? More so now that we have UNCRC incorporation into Scots law. Better inclusion in assessment, understanding and advocacy, as well as meaningful inclusion, is inclusion as prevention, surely.
Yes. I would perhaps phrase that or identify that. I would look at stigma. And again, that goes back to what John Marshall, I think, was saying about children who display these callous and unemotional traits, is the feeling of stigma that the child's behavior is a function of poor parenting in some way. And again, there's a lot of work I've done in children's panels, as an expert witness in various judicial arenas, is that it's the sort of condemnatory approach that a child displaying quite problematic behaviors at primary school is going to frustrate professionals involved. It's very frustrating as a teacher when you have a child who isn't adhering to normal social convention and the rules of the classroom, and distracting, disruptive, and I think there's a feeling parents feel disempowered, and they feel they're not being listened to, and they feel they're being judged. I think it's a lot more about stigma, and if we can construct those, and I myself, working at secondary school level, have had those difficult conversations with parents, the hard to reach parents, And I don't think I got anywhere. I don't think, with some of them, I don't think I succeeded at all, because they felt that I was, when I said, I think it would be useful for your child to be assessed because of non-attendance, because of disruptive behavior in school, etc., etc., then the parents would think that I was, as soon as you use the term mental health services, the terminology isn't helpful at all. And a lot of parents who themselves have had quite negative experiences in terms of schools and in terms of other professionals tend to avoid them. And that leads to increased vulnerability for their children if their children do need additional support and intervention. So I think there's a lot about parent advocacy, but there's something about the politics of mental health as well, and about where people sit, because currently psychiatrists and psychologists are held up to be the sort of demigods of mental health. And in fact, they very often have have less experience than teachers and social workers of normal family development, normal family function, and where to spot atypicalities in that, and to identify constructive solutions. So I partly agree, but I think destigmatization, as well as.
Sorry, Bill. I
Go
think
on,
also
Colley.
part of that is that we have all worked with carers and parents and within professional settings and personal. And I think what we find is we have parents who are saying that problematic behaviours are identified earlier, but it's put on the parents. So we have parents who are going through parenting courses, who are having really serious involvement with social work, sometimes to the point where we have parents who've said to us, I'm worried my child's going to be taken away from me. And it isn't until much later on that they get a diagnosis of neurodivergency. So it's really difficult when the interventions that are supposed to help turns out to be detrimental to the family as a whole.
Yes. And again, I suppose that illustrates the point about this uneven playing field, or the politics involved. And I've been through some horrible experiences of one child was taken away from a parent. He was aged 4 at the time, and very classic autism. In fact, I did the autism assessment, and he came with the highest score I've ever on the ADIR. And he was taken away because the mum was blamed. And it was only, I think, 8 years later that he got his autism diagnosis. And a tragic case, because a waste of, apart from the destruction of the family unit, it was the hundreds of thousands of pounds that had been spent unnecessarily on a young person who should have stayed with his mum, and his mum should have got a little bit of extra support. Not a lot. So I need to move on because I'm going to be accused of not. So this next study, and I think there's a break coming up fairly soon. So don't worry. But this is where the question I asked about the Tremblay study is: have you taken into account the mental health, developmental disorders, basically the genetic component of when we're looking at a large population study, epidemiological study? Have you taken that into account when you're looking at these risk groups? And this was Bieber and Wright's study based on the Cambridge data set, where that team looked specifically at the link between family dysfunction and antisocial behavior, looked at the relationship between dysfunction and the behavior, but also took into account the genetic inheritance of the child and the impact of the child on the family. So in other words, we get a diagram like this, where instead of just focusing on that central arrow between family dysfunction and the child, they also took into account, and when they looked at the data, the genetic inheritance and the impact of the child on the family, and explored the transgeneral nature of risk, which we all know exists, but we don't know why, or we're not clear why. And I've put the reference in because I can only capture what I think were the most significant conclusions, is that family risk did not determine which boys became embedded in an antisocial lifestyle as a single factor. Antisocial lifestyle significantly increased risk for the family, and that the origins of antisocial behavior are found early in life, well before adolescence. which ties in with Richard Tremblay's research that we looked at earlier, but also I think it gives a pat on the back and an endorsement to those who are involved currently in early intervention in families, and particularly development of speech and language, the development of play, mellow parenting programs. It really gives support to that type of initiative, because rather than dealing with the end result of a 16, 17, 18-year-old who's engaging in some quite offending behavior, that getting in earlier in a respectful, non-patronizing way with families, not sending them on a generic parenting course, which is what so many families of children with ADHD or autism resent. They resent being taught to be ordinary parents. What they want is more insight into how to be the parent of a child with ADHD, how to be the parent of a child with autism. So the generic parenting courses are seen as insulting and patronizing. And I think it goes back to what Tom was saying about a more collaborative approach, and more where there's a degree of advocacy for the parent, and there's a degree of political humility from all professionals, everybody involved, including parents, who, and as a parent, I'll put my hand up and say I wasn't an ideal parent. But it's the idea that there is support that can be put in place, and it must be done in a respectful way. So,
sorry, Bill, can I cut across there, particularly where advocacy matters? I remember when I was at A&S, I was involved in, not through A&S, but I was involved in an advocacy case that cut across 3 different authorities. There was addictions involved, there was housing involved, there was financial issues and abuse involved, and so on and so forth, as well as separation and numerous of other things. I don't know if you remember, Colley, but I mind back that one day for a session with an A&S, and that mind map on the whiteboard was unbelievable. The amount of different practitioners and professionals that were involved, the spend was absolutely astronomical, and for the sake of getting advocacy in at an early stage and ensuring the voices are heard and considerations are taken into account, the potential save there was absolutely unreal. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but on a rough count, it was a good 6-7 figures. Sorry, a good 5-6 figure saving over the period of time, from escalating to the point it got to issues getting resolved and family moving forward, and just the fact of there was advocate intervention, a bit of calming, a bit of change of language and getting used around the tables, and more interaction between everybody involved, empathy, appreciation and understanding included in that, by the way, that actually managed to get to the point where that 20-something-year-old lad was then eventually able to move into a bit of independent living, got his finances sorted out. There wasn't the to-ing and froing from parents trying to take control over this, that and the next thing, to fund their own addictions. They actually got to the point that lad actually eventually managed to get through a university course, and he's now in gainful employment. So there's important that interventions being timed right, but it's important that the right people are there, and the communication is not specifically tied to one type of form of language or other.
Yeah, again, I would endorse that point. It's a lot about politics, a lot about language use, it's about mutual respect, it's also about professional humility, and I think it ties in with what we're going to look at next before we take a break, which is the looked after population, which we know again is highly overrepresented in prison settings. What I would say about the case that you've just referred to, Tom, is that what we also found in the pilot study is that having an assessment, it's not about diagnosis. It's not about the diagnostic label. The diagnostic label gives a bit of a framework for thinking, but you don't stick that label on a child's forehead and say that is an ADHD child, that is an autistic child. What you say is that is a young person whose personality, whose personal profile is affected by their autism. And that leads us to think, as soon as I am brought into a case where autism involved, my first set of questions is, well, what are the difficulties and challenges facing that family and that young person? And what is the root of their anxiety? Anxiety. So autism to me equates almost directly to anxiety. And if you can understand the origins of the anxiety, then you can address a lot of the issues that are going to arise. And I have to move on, but this study, again, very authoritative by Tamsin Ford, looking at the looked after population across the UK. So Scotland was included in this, and the basic data is there, which I'm not going to refer to, but you can have a look at to see. It just shows basically the study design. Similarly, there, not skip through that, but when they looked at the different groups, so the children looked after by local authorities, what you can see in that left-hand column, not the extreme left-hand column, but the left-hand column, is the very high, the overrepresentation of psychiatric disorder in the looked after population. And although the study didn't address specifically this question, the question does arise, is have those psychiatric disorders led to the child being taken into care? And could that lead us to think in a different way about the type of support that might go into a family to avert that happening? Because we know that the state is a very poor parent as a whole. The outcomes are not good. The promise is looking to address that, but we get children who go through multiple placements, and I've been through that with one or two of my clients, where a child that was placed with a family, a clearly autistic child was placed with a family that had no capacity in order to support that child. They hadn't had the training, they didn't have that intuitive understanding of autism, and the child was sat on a naughty step. A 4-year-old child sat on a naughty step because they were rocking on a sofa. And of course that placement breaks down, but it leaves a legacy. It leaves a very negative legacy that can come into play later in life. A distrust of people, for example, social avoidance, a feeling of low self-worth because of repeated failure. When we get it wrong in a placement, it's not simply a case of the hassle of finding somewhere else. It's the damage to the child, and we're not good. The data shows that we're not good. So the more information and knowledge we have in an early stage to inform decision making and planning, to be able to identify the right type of environment, the cost savings are enormous. There are children currently in secure accommodation costing £300,000 a year who've done nothing wrong. They're there for their own safety, which was not the original purpose of the secure accommodation. They're there because there's nowhere else. And the question is, let's go back 2, 3, 4 years in that young person's life and say, is there something that could have happened much earlier on that could have redirected that developmental trajectory? So, yeah, conclusion from all of that data, all those figures in front of you: overrepresentation of anxiety disorders, overrepresentation of ADHD, overrepresentation of ASD in the looked after population. And then the conclusions, again, a lot of text, but Corey has helpfully highlighted the key one. Whether judged categorically or dimensionally, our studies showed that children looked after by local authorities had significantly poorer mental health than the most disadvantaged children outside the care system. So we're not comparing children in the care system with children in what we would call a conventional family, normal family. But we're looking at some of the most disadvantaged, and we're saying that even the most disadvantaged children outside the care system have better mental health than those in the care system. And then the question, there's a bit about diagnosis, how diagnosis could be very useful in pointing towards interventions that might work. But again, quite a nice emphasis. In other cases, it may be more appropriate to focus on changing the care or educational environment rather than labeling children as psychiatrically disordered. It talks about resident social workers are dealing with many children with serious psychiatric disorders, and yet many have had little training. And then it talks about foster children. And then it comes to the conclusion that the children may be in the care system because of failure of services to support them before they even get there, which I'm throwing that as something that's provocative. And I actually think that many people who are attending today will probably nod their heads and say, yeah, we're not getting it right because we don't have the resources. We're not sure our resources are structured and targeted in the right way. We're not sure that sometimes we get involved because we don't know. The information isn't coming to us to get involved at an early enough stage. So,
before we go for a break, can I pose a thought from listening globally, listening globally, thinking nationally, acting locally? Sorry, no, it wasn't that one. It was the one before that. When I did the piece at Neurodiversity, a societal question, using statistical proportionality in relation to prevalence ratios. By doing nothing, and this, bear in mind, this was 4 years ago, by doing nothing and continuing on the trajectory that we're going on, services are going to become completely unaffordable, because by doing nothing, the global cost was going to be somewhere in the region of 463 trillion US dollars a year. And that was basically just by standing still.
Yeah.
And improving absolutely nothing. So earlier intervention actually has a huge potential to save big time in the long term. And having been involved with the autism strategy for as long as I was, I am still astounded that we don't have the things in place that was meant to do.
No, and you know, I'm not sure the degree to which I should be giving my own views rather than the views of our collaborative. And I don't think I'm overstepping the mark when I say that the current mental health system, the idea that everything's about medical diagnosis, and we've got a medical system which isn't, I think everyone knows it's broken. But it doesn't mean that we shirk responsibility. That there may be, I think we need to restructure child and adolescent mental health significantly. It needs better resources, clearly. It needs personnel. It's very much a Cinderella service. It's not somewhere where you get great status. Those involved in CALMS at the moment are dealing with the most acute problem. They don't have time for chronic difficult. They're dealing with acute. They're dealing with suicides. They're dealing with children who are significantly self-harming, absconding, and it's a very demanding job and a very difficult job, and not a particularly rewarding job, because how I don't know, in fact, any family who's gone back to a psychologist and say thanks very much for that, it's changed our lives. No, it just doesn't happen. Yeah. So yeah,
actually I can cut across again there and say I'm aware of one family that did that. It was part of a pilot project.
Oh,
right.
There you go, connectivity, etc.
Okay, Tom, because you're managing this, what do you want to say about the break, how long the break is, and just those who are attending can...
What time are we at now? 11 minutes past 11, so we can take, what, 5 minutes?
Well, I was going to say 10. People might need to go to the loo and get a cup of tea. How
okay, 10. I'm fine with 10. If you
come back at 11,
ones covering the content. If you're happy with 10, I'm happy with 10.
Are you happy with 10, Phil?
Yep. Everybody else happy with 10?
There you go. We'll see you all in 9 minutes.
Right, okay, 11:20, that's fine.
Right, see you guys soon.
Cheers, thank you.
Try to focus more.
Sorry.
Okay. Lovely American boy. Yeah. So I said at the beginning, we're not going to look in with great precision at the different neurodevelopmental disorders, but in terms of the population that is neurodiverse, it's probably larger than we think. I would suggest that we are currently underestimating the number of children who have been affected in utero by substance use. So not just fetal alcohol, but any teratogen such as heroin. They're coming through a lot more. And certainly I'm finding that in clients who are fostering or who have adopted children, that these are very, 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 sometimes very, very complex, so complex that it's virtually impossible to apply a diagnostic label to them, because in order to understand how the brain has been affected and why it's been affected, you'd need to know at which particular stage in development in utero the insult had occurred, because it has has a different impact. In most cases, the way the brain develops from the brainstem outwards towards the frontal cortex, in normal development, neurons migrate. It's that migration process of the neuron that helps to develop the structure of the brain. And we know that the alcohol ingestion causes, there are about 7 different mechanisms that change with the exposure to alcohol in terms of the migration of those neurons. And it tends to lead to children who display quite ADHD characteristics because their prefrontal cortex is not just delayed in development, but hasn't developed and won't develop. So in the neurodevelopment, if we were to take all our problems, imagine in Scotland, we would say, right, we're going to focus in on a particular group of children, X thousand children, who are universally regarded as high risk and complex. Diagnosis may be very, very beneficial in pointing towards certain treatments, such as for ADHD or for high levels of anxiety, but in many cases isn't going to yield a huge amount. You're just going to define more clearly what the problem is without necessarily generating some wonderful, easy to apply solutions. So any insult, prenatal adversity, this is where we would talk about the AISEs. The AISEs come in. Perinatal adversity at and around the time of birth. So children who are born prematurely and put in incubators, we're now, I think, much more clued up that the mother needs to be present, the smell of the mother, the touch of the mother for those children in those incubators. But we've got a huge number of kids who've already gone through the system who are now older, who didn't have that more understanding exposure to the mother's contact early on in life, and that can affect them long term. They can have quite autistic-like characteristics without having autism, and whether you conceptualize that in terms of disruptive attachment and attunement is not for me, because I'm not a clinician able to suggest that. But perinatal adversity, early deprivation and trauma, and then acquired brain injury. So yeah, I've come across cases of kids who were absolutely developing normally, involved in a road traffic accident, and now have ADHD or diagnosable ADHD. So yeah. And then looking at that population, we think it's about 5%, between 5 and 7% of the population would meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, taking into account this controversy around the classification itself and where boundaries and thresholds are drawn, and the politics of medication and everything else. But let's just for now say that, yep, brain scans show, brain imaging shows differences in the function of the brain, the structure of the brain, and development long-term of the brain. Then I thought this was quite from William Pelham, one of America's leading experts on ADHD. From his analysis, a third of children with ADHD will have tolerable outcomes, but 1/3 will have moderately poor outcomes, and 1/3 will have bad outcomes. And it's the bad outcome that really lends itself to inclusion in this presentation of severe dysfunction, psychopathology, sociopathy, and that development of those sociopathic characteristics, which takes us back to the Alicia McPhail case and to some of the other more notorious cases, to the William Black case, a guy who was a serial killer and had been through the care system and multiple placements and everything else. It leads us to think about the processes by which we develop our social skills in life, and raises some interesting questions about why that might be disruptive. And in the ADHD population, for all that these kids can be the class clowns and disruptive and seem to have lots of friends, what the normal outcome of a young person who fits into that, and usually boys, but not exclusively boys, but the normal outcome is that when they leave school, they don't have the same social interaction. They become socially isolated. They tend to use cannabis or other substances, and they tend to be socially isolated and depressed. And it's often the depression gets treated before the ADHD if they haven't already been diagnosed. So, and of course, there are those who find themselves in the criminal justice system. And one particular case springs to mind of a young man who'll be in his late 20s now, who had a very disruptive schooling. I think he was sent away to residential and came back. His life was falling apart, but then he got a job He got a job, a temporary job with the Network Rail or someone like that. And his mother describes the transformation in his life, that he got up in the morning, he showered, he made himself a packed lunch, he went to work, he came home. Weekends he went out and probably got drunk, but that's not the important thing because that's relatively normal. But when that job ended, his life fell apart again, and he's now in prison for murder. He was associated with someone who killed a man, and it just raises some very interesting points about the importance of structure in lives. That the importance of going to work or to college or staying in education is critically significant. And the next slide, or the one after this, I think, shows that the pathway that we think that links ADHD, the 5% in the community that we think have ADHD, to the 40% in young offenders institutions who have ADHD, or the 25% in adult jails. So the issue of heritability and the transgenerational nature of risk that Beaver and Wright were touching upon in their study suggests that if we look at autism, the heritability rate is very high. Someone in the family is likely to have autism, not exclusively so. You get de novo genetic mutations that can cause autism, and often very complex autism. But generally speaking, there's someone in the family, and it has been passed down. ADHD likewise. And in fact, one of the problems I face when raising, on a number of occasions, when raising the possibility with a set of parents and suggesting that assessment might be wise, is the kickback, well, Jimmy's just like his father. So it's not ADHD, he's just like his father. And they say, well, where is his father? Oh, he's in jail. And that sounds terribly condemnatory and negative, but I think it illustrates that sometimes our thinking can be prejudiced in certain ways, and it makes having meaningful conversations quite difficult, which is not to say that we shouldn't have them.
Can I cut in for a second, just reflecting back? Billy's made a good question actually on the chat. Just discussed in previous session, and the reflection is that can there be a clear message for professionals working on the front line that will best divert or engage with those at highest risks for a unified approach to help them? Wow, that's a really interesting question.
It's a fairly profound, very important question. I reiterate what I say about the problems, because actually what I've just said, it almost seems to contradict the point I was making about the politics, that if parents don't respect professionals, then it's very difficult to intervene, as well as the other way around. And I think it's because the language we're using can be quite adversarial, quite condemnatory, judgmental. It's not only the professionals are doing that, parents are doing that as well, but from a point of view of anxiety, of feeling judged, stigmatized, not knowing how, not having the communication skills to know how to change a conversation around so that it can be more collaborative. And that's where advocacy comes in, because that's where I think good advocates can change the tone and the content of a meaningful conversation and make it work better. But in terms of giving, it's very easy to sit here. I'm in southern Spain at the moment, by the way, in a mountain house 3,200 feet up in the Sierra Nevada, and it's 70 outside. It's 20. So put that in your feedback forms.
Thanks for making us jealous, Bill.
No, but it's very easy to sit here and say, oh, we should change the system, or we should all be more respectful. It requires quite a lot of work, and within the culture of organizations, as well as demanding of parents or trying to influence parents to think in terms of collaborating more. And we're talking about some very, very, very hard to reach parents and very hard to reach families. So,
Bill, can I give the example of the one that we very recently worked with, that family, as an example of advocacy, where a grandparent came along to one of our carer sessions. asked for some support. We did the DOBA assessment, and it was very clear through that assessment that no one was on the same page. It was very clear from that assessment that at least one of the parents was neurodivergent themselves. And it was very clear that there was maybe not a lack of acknowledgement, but certainly that this person's neurodivergence was seen as a flaw, was seen as a challenge, was seen as something that was bad. And I think through advocacy, it was the first time that really all the people in the room were on the same page for the individual. And I just wish that we had that sort of system for every individual who goes through this process, because that person before, even though they were 22, was very much not heard, and their voice was not heard because of all these different barriers coming in.
Yeah, and the in that particular case, there were cultural and ethnic
Yes,
barriers, or if not barriers, then tensions or friction that got in the way of having conversations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I can't, that question is so profound. I can't even. I need to go to bed and think about it, which I'm not going to do now, unfortunately. So, yeah, in terms of the ADHD, developmental impact of ADHD. You can read the list yourselves. You don't need me to go through it in one of these boring PowerPoint presentations. But added to the forensic problems and the other issues that are described there, there's also very strong evidence about impact on morbidity and mortality. And in fact, women with ADHD have a shorter lifespan, significantly shorter lifespan than men with ADHD, or it impacts on them more, for reasons that we don't fully understand. But that's the data coming through some of the Danish studies. So again, one of my colleagues, Susie, or a couple of my colleagues, Susie Young and Gisela Good-Johnson, have done a lot of work in the prison system. And I thought the data was quite interesting there, that the ADHD rate in young offenders is about 40% and 24% in adults. It's highly significant. And if you think in terms of policy and the current situation in the prison system of overcrowding, and you think in terms of the cost, not just the financial cost of running a prison and maintaining a place in the prison, but also the opportunity cost. And then think of those people who are not contributing, who are not taxpayers, who are not contributing in some way. And I know people who've been through the system and who've come out, sometimes with the help of diagnosis, but rarely so, but who've just managed to get their lives together in some way. One of the best ways to support a young man with ADHD is to get him married to an organized woman. There you go. It's not a treatment that seems to be available on the NHS at the moment, but providing a structure in life and some boundaries and everything else. There are, for all that William Pelham talks about these very negative outcomes, you get success stories that buck the trend, and they're often young people who failed in school. They come out with few, if any, qualifications, but cognitively they've got it, but they just can't hold it together in the particular environment of school, and they end up running plumbing companies, joinery, building companies. They become entrepreneurs. They do some drivers, because although you would think that ADHD is a risk in driving because of the inattention, if the person finds it stimulating enough to drive, that continual change of environment, needing to maintain attention, being alert, driving can be a very good job for someone with ADHD. It's counterintuitive, but in a sense it can. So all that really does is provide, I suppose, substance for what I'm saying, that neurodevelopmental disorders create vulnerability and risk in terms of offending and for being incarcerated. But I qualify that by saying that if we look simply, in the case of ADHD, let's take those diagnostic characteristics of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. If you tend to think, well, they're impulsive, so they do something, they shoplift because they just happen to be in a shop and see, that's an oversimplification of what seems to be the developmental trajectory. It's more the one on the top, where you get disengagement from education, social isolation, joining gangs, which I think, and again, you think of that in very negative terms because that tends to lead to negative consequences. But change the question and say, well, why is it with someone with ADHD joins a gang and maintains membership of that gang as they go around stealing or taking cars? And it's because they're getting something, they're getting structure from the gang. There's a sense of progression. There's the tasks are, they can accomplish the task. They're not being given a French test, which they can't do because they can't remember how to conjugate a verb. But
there's also a sense of inclusion, Bill.
Yes, absolutely. And one of my colleagues studied gangs in Rio and London, did a sort of comparative study and found, as you'd expect, rates of ADHD very, very high. Again, overrepresented in gangs. But rather than thinking of it simply in terms of the negative and negative consequences, it can be helpful to think about, well, why is it? Why are they getting something from that? And in the same way that a question I posed to some of my support groups, when they talk about failing in education, parents will say to me, my son can't have ADHD because he was 4 hours on the computer last night on one particular game. How come he can spend 4 hours on the computer on a computer game, but he can't sit still for 5 minutes in the history lesson at school? And the answers that came back when I said, right, you think this through, the answers that came back, well, the computer game is stimulating. You've got visual simulation, you've got auditory simulation, you've got a sense of structure and progression. You can fail, but you're not going to you don't get condemned for that. Whereas if you fail in your history test or you fail socially in the playground, you feel crushed. Your self-esteem takes a hit. If you get killed in a computer game and you restart that, you can do that. And I think all of those things come into play, which also provokes us to think about how could we make our education system a bit more like computer games? How could which is again a very simplistic way of approaching it, because the child with autism in your class who wants a low arousal environment, wants predictability and wants structure, isn't going to respond to an all singing, all dancing lesson that pleases the kid with ADHD. Let's not be simplistic about it. But anyway, it's that route, it's that developmental trajectory that's important. And I would emphasize that term substance use, because that seems to be quite common, again, in the population that end up offending. Whether they're self-medicating their ADHD symptoms or they're using substances for other reasons is, there's been a lot of work on that. And when I do my adult ADHD assessments and the question is there, do you use substances? You don't leave it at yes. You say, well, what substances do you use? Why do you use them and what impact do they have on you? Because when you're doing an assessment for ADHD, what you find is a lot of people say, yeah, I've used cocaine. What impact did it have on you? Well, interestingly, they will say, I took it as part of a group, bit of fun. Everyone else in the group wanted to go out clubbing. I just wanted to go home and tidy my flat and to finish the dissertation that has been sitting there for 6 months. It gave them greater focus. And it's one of the mechanisms that we know in ADHD, the parts of the brain that are understimulated, which is why certain medications are used as a treatment option. But we're going too far, I think, in that respect. And then I think the question, what are the cognitive differences that may contribute specifically to offending in a neurodiverse population? I've already mentioned delays or differences in the development of empathy. So what I'm suggesting to all of us present today is that our behavior is less governed by the rules, societal rules around us, than by the fact that we have empathy. We don't like upsetting other people. We don't want to offend other people. We don't want to cause harm to other people. And it's empathy, which is a much stronger force in the way we control our behaviors than a rule, for example. And then you have weaknesses in impulse inhibition. The term central coherence, if you're familiar with the autism, you know that central coherence is this idea of seeing the big picture. So the young man who walks up to a girl and touches her on the breast because he wants to know what it feels like doesn't have good coherent central coherence, doesn't have the bigger picture of the impact it's going to have on her family, understanding himself in that context and the way he is going to be judged. That's not a factor that's going to influence his decision to do what he has done. And then very rigid thinking, which again is a characteristic of or one of the common characteristics of the population that we currently label autistic. And that can lead to stalking behavior. It can lead to obsessive behaviors, which may be socially unacceptable, and are not always, even though it looks as if they have a sexual dimension, they're not always sexually motivated. And Colley, I think, is going to discuss something about sexualized behavior and offending in her present, which I'm anxious to move on to. The craving for stimulation. The guy who, with the 3 teenagers in the car, takes the corner at 70 miles an hour rather than 30. It's stimulating. It's the computer game in reality, isn't it? And is that something that is driving a lot of the offending behaviors? And then there's critical differences in understanding self as opposed to others. So in the autistic population, we talk about theory of mind, the ability to conceptualize the mental state of other people, but also ourselves as distinct from that. There are the weaknesses there which can lead to problematic behaviors. So I am now going to pass on to my colleague Colley, who is going to address one of the areas that is a great concern to society, but also in terms of this a problem that we don't appear to have a very good understanding of or be getting to grips with. So Colley, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just in the conversation here before we start, because obviously I'm getting distracted, having a really good conversation about the use of drugs with Lynn and also with Tom. Tom's in there as well. I like that. Everyone, the idea that when we talk about substance abuse and ADHD, we're not talking about necessarily people using these substances in the same way as everybody else. You know, it's people having an energy drink so they can have a better nap. It's people smoking cannabis so that they can quieten their brain. As you say, it's people taking cocaine and then actually for the first time feeling clear-headed. It's wild, isn't it? Okay, so hello. So we're going to talk about a case study from someone who I have named Joey. It's obviously an anonymous case study from the west of Scotland from a few years ago now, and we'll see an update on how it has gone since, how Joey is doing from a kind of semi-rural area of the west of Scotland. So Joey, at the time when I met him, was 17. He was diagnosed with ADHD and trauma and suspected ASD. Honestly, I think it was pretty clear. Mum was going through the diagnostic criteria. His newborn sister was going through it too, so I think it was very much part of the family's life. And he was attending college 1 day a week. He was really struggling attending mainstream school, so he was in college for 1 day a week. He had very limited social interactions. He was very talented at boxing, and it was a way for him to really, I suppose, use his hyperactivity for a positive cause. But he was banned from the local club because of the conflicts he was having with the social element of the boxing club. He was an incredibly sensory-seeking individual, often getting into fights, punching walls. So there was quite a lot of physical aggression, not primarily towards people, but sometimes did end up that way. So reasons for the input. The young person had a very specific sexual fetish that actually I had never encountered before in my work, and I primarily work in sexual health and relationships. He was asking girls he knew when it was online, and also strangers on websites like Chat Roulette, to take part in this sexual fetish exploration. So will you do this? Will you do that? Will you dress this way? Will you say these words to me? One of the girls at the time was 13. She was pretending to be 15. And the police and social work got involved because, as you can imagine, it was very traumatic for her as well to be part of that process. Joey really struggles with impulse control, and this need to explore this fetish had begun to overtake his online interactions. But if I'll be honest with you, overtake his brain. You know, it had become almost an addiction for him. And what was interesting was that for him, you know, he was a 17-year-old boy. And I think for 17-year-old boys who are heterosexual and are speaking to girls, there is a lot of focus and a lot of motivation. But for him, it got to the point where it was seriously impacting his mental health, his self-esteem, and his self-worth, and also the relationships he had with his family. So what my role was to support Joey to actually understand why the police were involved, because he was hyper-focused on the fact, well, this individual told me they were 15, so the fact that she was lying isn't my fault. And it was on the injustice of being right versus wrong. But what I wanted to do was actually find a way to meet this need, because he was looking outwards for this need, and that was what was getting him conflict with the law. And we needed to think, okay, how can we actually meet this sexual need without necessarily allowing him to sexually assault others? So how did we do that? Oh, Bill, you're going to have to do the slide for me. Can you click for me? Thank you. So what did we do? The first thing I did with him one-to-one is discuss the need. So we had quite a long conversation about the fetish that he had. We talked about the impact that had on his social interactions, how that impacted him interacting online, which is actually how he was doing most of his social interactions. And for him, he came to me with a 5-page double-sided A4 letter to me, explaining just how much this was impacting his life, because he really struggled to say it verbally. And he wanted to visualize, he was an incredibly talented illustrator. He wanted to visualize this special interest, but he was so scared of being caught. He was so scared that his mum was going to go into his room and see all these images and panic or freak out, and he had quite a lot of shame around the fetish that he had, because you know it wasn't necessarily something that was in mainstream. So there was so much going on when it came to this need. So how did we meet the need? The first thing we did is we tried to explore safe ways for Joey to explore this special interest of his. So one of the first things he did is we allowed him a safe space to actually illustrate these fantasies that he had, but also create boundaries with him and his mum. Because his mum, for example, would go and check in his room because she was really concerned about the conversations he was having online. So we spoke to mum, we talked about how actually there's a part of his room that she's not allowed to go in. He was allowed private time where no one was allowed to interrupt him, but also they had a keep out sign on his door, which allowed him to have a sense of control over people perceiving him while he was exploring this interest of his. Also, you know, he was 17, he wasn't yet 18, but there's a lot of other people on the internet who also had and wanted to experience this. So it was just giving him a heads up, giving his family a heads up that actually when illegally he turns 18, he can explore this online with other people. So prepping that idea to him and his family was really important, because what we didn't want him to do is stumble upon this on his own, and then potentially become even more vulnerable when he finds a community online who have the same special interests. Can you go to the next slide if that's okay, Bill? Thank you. So, what did we actually do to support this individual? Well, the first thing we talked about is navigating the relationships online, because this was the reason why we were called in. This was the reason why I was able to work with this individual through the social work. And what he identified was that he just doesn't have any impulse control at all when engaging with people online. He couldn't find a way to stop himself asking these questions, stop himself requesting these specific acts. So we had a conversation discussing of consent, and it was very interesting, Bill, you were talking about that idea of a spectrum of serious crimes versus not so serious crimes. And for him, as far as he was concerned, this 13-year-old lying about her age was as serious as what he had said to her and what he had proposed to her. So we talked about the scale of that. We talked about the age of consent. We talked about the content and the law. So actually what is legal to talk about, what isn't legal to explore. But also we talked about the impact on others. And I think for him that was really difficult because he already had extreme shame. I think it was also important to talk about how for him this is his special interest. This is the thing that he speaks about most in the world. But actually for other people it might not only not be their special interest, but it might be upsetting. This is something that other people might be alarmed by, for example. So when it came to the idea of, okay, how do we deal with this long term, he acknowledged that he couldn't be in control of his own impulses, especially at nighttime. So his laptop was kept in the living room, and he was only able to use his laptop in the living room. And his mum was always in the living room with his smaller sibling. Joey's phone was left in a safe in the kitchen to charge during bedtime. Now, this is a newer type of safe, but it is very much like this. It was a big wooden box, and you could put a timer on it, and it would only open after a certain amount of time. And that might seem extreme, but for him, he openly said, "I'm going to try and get into that box, and I know it. I'm going to try everything I can to get this phone back box." So we made it like we made sure we got one that looked really cool and had codes on it. And I think having that transition for him, for my interactions socially are now finished, I'm going to put it in the safe, and I cannot get these social interactions back until the morning when I'm doing my usual routine. I think that really reduced his anxiety because he felt a lot more in control of what was happening. Family support was also really important. Mum had a lot of religious trauma and a huge amount of shame of what was happening, especially because this individual was living in a village. It was talked about among their peers. Obviously, things like Facebook groups and stuff where this child was mentioned. She was shamed on the streets for what was happening. So we tried to get mum some counselling to support her through this, but also talk about how there is a link between special interests becoming sexualized and neurodivergence, talking about how there is, there's a higher likelihood of specific fetishes amongst neurodivergent people as well, but also acknowledge that this is a 17-year-old boy who was very emotionally immature as well. So he was working on a level of emotional immaturity of maybe 10, 11 years old, but with the body of a 17-year-old, who had extreme urges. We were able to have open conversations with the mum and the individual at the same time. So it was often the first time that Joey was able to talk about these things with his mum in a way that felt safe because we were there. Also, he came to her with solutions, which I think was such a huge part of that process, where instead of, he very much felt he was being punished all the time, he wasn't allowed to live his life. But when he was able to say to her, I need to have the laptop in the living room, is that okay? I think he felt he was having a sense of control over his own progress as an individual. But also the mum supporting the control of the devices. She at the time felt, well, he's an adult, he should know what to do with this. But it isn't until we talked about impulse control and talked about all the other parts that I think she realized that even if he is in fact 17 years old, he might need more input around impulse control for longer in his life as well. So Belle, can you go to the next slide for me if that's okay? So what are the outcomes? There were no more incidents of Joey coercing people online. So it stopped that happening simply because he wasn't allowed to have the devices in his room. It was as simple as that for him. He categorized public and private, and things that he talked about or things that he explored in his private time in his room were very different to what he would look at publicly in the living room. Joey found a community online, a kink community that allowed him to explore this with other people who also enjoyed this. And I think when people think of that, they think of people having extreme sex parties and stuff, but it's not. It's people on Reddit who create forums where they are respectful spaces, where people have very safe rules and people put in very strong boundaries about how you interact within this. So it was a self-policing community, but who had the same interests as him, which I think is actually what he was looking for when he was trying to engage with people online. He was hoping that someone else would say online, oh, I also have this interest, why don't we explore this together? But then he found that group. And I think when he found that group and they were having really good practice with how they communicate with others, that really helped him understand his role within exploring his own sexuality. Joey also spent a lot more time with his family because he wasn't sitting in his room hiding. He wasn't being secretive with what he was doing. He didn't feel like his mum was checking on him all the time because he was in the living room and he was able to still use his laptop and use his phone. So I think that really helped mum, because mum at this point had a 1.5-year-old and then had a 17-year-old, and she was really struggling as a single mum. So I think it was really useful for them as a family to have more time. And mum actually said, you know, he knows his sister now. You know, they actually have a good relationship, and having that relationship really bonded him and helped his self-esteem because he became a helper. He became not quite a parent, but you know, someone who had responsibilities out with himself. He also got a trial run back at boxing because mum went to boxing and said, look, this is what's happening. He's going for an ASD diagnosis. He was able to acknowledge what had happened at boxing and apologize for it. And he went on a trial back with them with quite a lot of restrictions, but he also got a boxing bag in his room. And that was really good because his room used to be a place of shame, a place of conflict, a place of danger, but now his room had become a place for outlet where he was able to use the punching bag instead of punching the wall, which is what was happening before. So 3 years later, what has happened? Well, Joey moved into a supported living unit with 3 other males, and unfortunately, quite soon after, he spoke about his fetish in detail with a female support worker. And he was asking very inappropriate questions, and she really felt uncomfortable, and she no longer worked with Joey and was moved to a different place. But I think what's important for that is to show that just because we work with an individual and try and sort the problem doesn't mean they can apply it to other settings. Because of the neurodivergency, there was so much more complication, you know, it becomes so much more complex, where he was now able to find the parameters of what he was allowed to talk about online and where and who with. But when it came to in reality, in real life, he thought this was a person who was supporting him and he could talk about it in a way that, you know, would be almost not quite friendly, but you know, this was supposed to be a support worker and he was looking for support. And instead, he actually really crossed a huge boundary. So Joey will most likely have to learn and apply these new rules every time he changes the setting, whether it's being at work, whether it's joining volunteering, whether it's being a parent himself when he's older, whether it's having a sexual relationship for the first time. He is considering using sex work to explore this sexuality in prison. And I think we understand where that's coming from. This might be for him potentially the safest way to do this. So that's another controversial thing to say out loud, that actually sex work can be a very productive way for someone to explore that in a safe way, as long as we support the sex worker who is part of the interaction as well. So that's kind of showing that there are some great successes when we do this kind of work, but also how complex an individual is. Because what I met was a person with ADHD who, as far as everyone else was concerned, had groomed a 13-year-old. But as you can see from this, it was so much more complex.
Thanks, Corey. That's brilliant. I want to come in, or I have an impulse to come in. I'm trying to control my impulse and rather ask Tom, is there anything in the chat related to what Corey's just said?
Not yet, there isn't, but like allow people a couple of minutes to process stuff, and there may well be. But I've got a question for Colley, if I may ask. What involvement do you have, or do other practitioners have, in ensuring that Joey can go about things in a safe environment without running the risk of offending others? So I suppose the question is, what assessments and measures have been put in place?
I think the answer is not a lot, apart from him having a great relationship with his social worker. I think that's a really, really powerful point. But you know, he's soon not going to be part of that social work department, and he's going to have to move on. But this is a huge point, is that just because we've solved the problem in that moment and avoided more conflict with law, where is there another me in his area that's able to support him and support the family? And the answer is, I don't know if there's another me in the country.
No. Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, right. Okay.
But it's a really good point, is how do we long-term support this person? It's another example of how neurodivergency is a lifelong condition. It's something that we need to support someone throughout their life. But very good point, Tom.
Corey, I do know of another you, not maybe as good as you, but no, I know someone who's a neurodevelopmental expert who works in Broadmoor.
Right.
She works with some of the country's most serious sex offenders, and the reason that it's very intense work, and it requires huge amounts of supervision, because she is at risk. Obviously, I don't mean physical risk, but also mental health risk.
Yes.
But I think, like you, one of the things I wanted to pick up on was the fact that this idea of diagnosis, having a diagnostic label. There are a number of arguments around that, but it was more your intuition and understanding of the autistic nature of his thinking and process that led you to the solutions that, okay, they're partial solutions. It's not a problem solved, but it's a problem managed, or a set of challenges being managed. And that's why I think it's very important. Going back to the Tamsin Ford study about looked after children, many of whom have been diagnosed when they entered the care system, but it does change your way of thinking. So I ran in a residential establishment. If a child came to me without any label and without any information leading us to pre-plan the placement, the first thing you might do is say, right, we want this young person to feel at home, we want them to socialize with the others, we want them to take them on trip. If they came with the label autism, or even a sense that they might be autistic, I would approach it, as a manager, I would approach it in a very different way. And I would say, most important thing is for this young person to feel safe.
Yes.
And sticking them in a social situation, is not going to make them feel safe. In fact, the opposite. I would say, this is your room. This is your care. These are your two care workers who are going to be working with you, and the socialization would come later and in a much more gradual way. So placements will break down where children are inappropriately placed, and inappropriate demands are made of them, given their perhaps undiagnosed condition at that point. So there were a number of points about this case study that I thought were interesting. The first one was the capacity of Joey to feel shame.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is a good thing.
Yes.
It wasn't working in his favor because he felt, but he had the capacity to feel shame. And I would say that, on a list of characteristics, that's a major asset, because shame, again, is one of those things that can help us to condition our behavior. I don't want to feel ashamed, therefore I might change my behavior. The other is and again, I think this is very important in children who display quite challenging aggressive behavior at times, is this urge to express. Very often, this thing called alexithymia, where you don't recognize your own emotions. You can't put a label to something that you feel inside. You can't call it anger. You can't call it rage, because you don't have the vocabulary or the ability to identify this horrible feeling that you have. I had a young man, a very, very bright 17. I mean, university and everything else since then. But at school, he would fly into rages. He would have meltdowns, and he would. A common characteristic is he would damage things. He would punch holes in walls. And I managed to contrive a situation where I was able to have a conversation with him when he was in a calm frame of mind.
Yeah.
Not at the time. You don't
Yes.
do it when, but and I said, why do you do that? I'm just interested. Tell me. And he said, I don't know, but I need to have a physical representation of something that I feel inside. And the punch, the hole in the wall is that, which I found, again, very fascinating, because it allows you to start thinking about other ways in which the need to express, the urge to express, can be met without it being destructive in nature.
Yes.
And sometimes that's through music. In the case of Joey, he found himself articulate in a language called illustration. Yes,
absolutely.
And it becomes a fascinating medium. Working with kids in primary schools who similarly, they draw little cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
I've got some, I've kept some from a decade ago because they're so fascinating, where you instead of, when you want to discuss with them an incident, a meltdown that's happened, some crisis that's happened, what we do, if we consider ourselves neurotypical, is talk about it.
Yeah.
But it might not be the best method of communication from someone on the autism spectrum. It might be a cartoon, an illustration. And I found that a much more effective medium, because even sitting next to a child, trying to have a conversation with them, if you are facing them,
yes,
that can be threatening, it can be overstimulating. But if you are sat next to them looking at a piece of paper on which they've drawn a cartoon illustration of why they told the teacher to fuck off or hit another child, something like that, and you make it, because it's cartoon, it takes a lot of the tension out of the subject matter. So
I'm glad you said that, Bill, because one thing that happened with Joey is that he showed me his first illustration, the one he wanted, and it was art. It was beautiful. And it had a very sexually explicit part of it, but the amount of detail he put into it, and I saw for the first time that this special interest wasn't just sexual. It was an embodiment of everything he liked. It was artistic, it was creative. It was like he used watercolors, like this, and all he kept on saying was, I just want to see this in real life. I just want to see someone do this for me in real life. But instead, he'd been villainized as someone who groomed a 13-year-old. I think you're right when you're saying that, but also the whole point of this webinar is about, we're looking at the context of the person. It's the autism right?
But critically, it's also about the relationship of that young person in the family unit, and I think to break down some of the barriers that might exist there. And of course, I look at this case and I think, well, if you hadn't come along, this might be a headline in the local newspaper.
Yeah. Well, it was. That's the worst part. It was, in the local newspaper, but if it had been 3 or 4 years, it would have been the Daily Mail.
Yeah. So, I think that's an interesting case study. Tom.
Yeah, no, can I just pick up on a point in the chat, and really they're about consistency and communication, which I think is absolutely relevant. And one point says, I'm finding this working with a young person with ASD and presenting with inappropriate sexual behaviour. We can approach this situation using all the available resources. However, they are not available to retain the information. The individual is not available to retain the information. And trying to encourage their education provision to regularly reinforce these messages, but it's quite difficult. And I'll come in on that point, and that's absolutely a very, very valid point, that unless you have, and this is something that wasn't to do with inappropriate behaviour, it was to do with just general communication and strategic approaches in relation to my own daughter. And that was about getting the consistency of approach by everybody that was working with her.
Yes, absolutely.
So that the messages were constantly sinking in and so on and so forth. And I'm pleased to say that when she did start at a certain age, inappropriate behaviour, it was very quickly brought under control, because there was the same explanation being used, the same consistency being used. And no, you don't do that here. That's your bedroom job. or something to that effect. Exactly. It's out the road. You set the boundaries. You make sure they get and understand the parameters. Another point, what it's just in relation to that, it's just reinforcing that. I couldn't agree more in terms of the different ways to communicate about these issues. I'm interested to know if there are, and this is, if there were other resources or visuals that you need used with Joey that you could signpost to that facilitate those discussions with him. I appreciate it. It sounds like Joey was able to create his own illustrations.
Yeah.
So is there, or is that something that
I had to make them at the time? Certainly there are stuff about what's private behaviors and what's public behaviors, so stuff around what's private illustrations versus public illustrations. We were able to put in visual routines that included private time for people, but the stuff around him, we did a flow chart which helped him. But you know, I'm certainly willing to pass on, like if anyone comes to us with a question, I'm sure we can.
I'm going to make a suggestion here.
Yes.
As we're creating our new website, we're putting in community, by community, for community. Can we create something associated to that and make it part of it?
Let's do it.
Access it as a PDF without it being overly explicit, but illustrative. I think that would be very supportive.
And I think, Tom, you've got the right thing that Karina was saying about, you know, having to reinforce it. Like my brother, who's 48 and he's autistic, and every 3 months his stepdad teaches him how to shave because he cannot retain that information, and that's just learned and that's part of his support plan. But you don't find that with sexual stuff. You don't find that people reinforce the rules around for black and white thinkers, or because it's a skill. And Karina, you've got a good point. If people can't retain that message, and Karina, if you want, you know, I work with schools directly on this sort of subject, so maybe that's something to think about in the future.
Yeah, and just to further illustrate, I think we need to move on because
sorry.
I was just going to make the point about time, Bill. That's quarter past.
I know.
1 to 5 10-minute discussion with everybody at the end, so everybody has a say so.
Yeah, so one of the points I'd make, and it follows on from Corey's case study, is that when I was a manager of, I wanted to know whether behaviours like this are considered child protection matters. I posed that question. I posed it to the care inspectorate that was involved. I posed it, and I gave illustrations. The boy who goes up to a girl and sniffs her hair.
Yes.
Example. Is that a child protection matter? Is it a child protection matter if he becomes sexually aroused by them?
Yeah.
Does that make it different? And I posed a series of things that are quite common in special schools, socially inappropriate behaviour, and no one would give me an answer. The regulators wouldn't give me an answer. I asked the NSPCC to do training on that, and they wouldn't give me an answer. What came back is you'll have to contact the procurator fiscal.
Wow.
So in the context of the regulatory environment, with which we're all, you know, trembling with fear about, knowing what is a safeguarding or a child protection matter and what isn't. Is very difficult. I did see what one authority, I think it was Clackmannanshire, I think it produced child protection guidelines, which were very, very sensible, and said no. If this is an aspect of the disability, if you want to put it in those terms, then you do need to approach it in a different way, in a much more considered and sympathetic. You don't report everything to the police or to a child protection team if it's a behaviour that is synonymous with the disability. So anyway, I'll leave that because I think I'm going to. Can I just race through, see if there's anything in the debris that's left of my presentation that is worth. Maybe we should do a webinar on executive function, high order thinking. But certainly one presentation I do that tends to go down very well is neurodevelopmental disorders and the crisis cycle. So crisis, tantrums, meltdowns, periods of heightened disorganized behavior, as I think of them, the understanding how cognitive differences may influence the behaviors and allow you to allow you to avert the major crisis. That is, and of course, those crises can lead to contact with the criminal justice system. It would take me 2 hours to go through that, so we're not going to do it now. But I think having a familiarity with the term executive function and how executive function is impaired is really useful, and can lead to some pointers. So how do we deploy executive function? The ability to stand back, the ability to try to see the bigger picture, the inner dialogue that occurs that can allow strategies to develop as you're dealing with a crisis or threat or stressor. How you use scripts, how as a worker working with young children or young people, you can embed scripts, thinking scripts, allow them to adopt more constructive outcomes. Very, very important. So we're talking very importantly about the role of language, the use of memory and planning. All of these things are fairly critical. And I think to go back to those the earlier research that we were considering, what seems to be clear is that by the time you're getting to 16, 17, 18, it's almost too late. It's because of the legacy issues, because of the delays in development and developmental experiences that really I'll go back to poor old John Marshall, who got pilloried for this psychopaths in the playground interpretation of what he was saying. Is that we really need to identify these at-risk groups earlier, and in a subtle way. I don't mean you extract them from school and take them off to some specialist service, but in a subtle way, the building of social skills, the building of an awareness of self, even if it's not associated with neurodivergence, it could be any sort of problems that are manifesting themselves. Early intervention is clearly, indisputably, much better than addressing problems 10 years down the line. So I left my summary slide blank because I wanted the participants to write the summary. We could go back to the original take-home messages and say, well, have I addressed those or not, or at least dipped my toe into certain critical areas. But what I hope that the presentation has illustrated is the different way of thinking, the non-punitive, the more collaborative, with a base knowledge of autism, a base knowledge of ADHD or Tourette's or any of the other neurodevelopmental disorders. Having that knowledge is insufficient. And I found that those who've gone off and done postgraduate, I've got postgrad in autism, but I don't think that helped me as much as working directly with young people and working directly with other experts. It's those case studies, it's the individual case management that is very important, then the learning you take from it, and then you develop an intuition. So within my local authority, some of the best and most intuitive people for working with children with autism had no qualification. They were support assistants, but they had intuition. They had maybe direct family experience. They had that intuition.
Sorry, Bill, I'm going to cut across again. There's a post there. What's Corey has done it? I'm just drawing attention to your post there, Corey, about Joanne Barry and Fife. And there's a link there for information if anybody wants it. It's in the chat. We will share it when we will send out the slides, and we will be going through the chat just to make sure we haven't missed anything and give you a response to it. So it'll probably be next week before you get that information, but it will come. So please feel free to put anything else in there. I like to thank my colleagues for what they've done. We're at 20 past, so let's have a nice bit of free chat. The other point going in there is about early intervention, and there's a thank you from Susan, from Bernardo's. Thank you, really informative and giving me lots to reflect on. And on that, can I just draw attention to something else we do by community for community? You can download this from our website. We produce inspiration and reflective reading list. That's where content and reading is nominated or suggested by community, and they don't go on the list until there's 5 or 6 different nominations for the same thing. So it doesn't come from us, it comes from community. When I say community, I mean individuals, parents, carers, and professionals across the board. That's absolutely important. Can I draw the fact to our evaluation, which I'll let Corey explain because Corey deals with that bit.
It's a QR code. How fancy is that? Now, I've put the link into the chat. But if you've not used a QR code before, you get your phone out and you put your camera, and then it should come up in something like open in Chrome or open in Safari. And then you have a very short multiple choice evaluation. This really, really helps us understand what you're looking for, how it's been, and the more honest you can be, the better.
And I think also those areas that in the presentation we weren't able to develop because of time.
Yes.
If it's something that stood out,
yes.
you know, could we have a webinar, or could we do something on a particular area? Then, you know, please, it's not taken as a criticism. It might be a criticism, but it's not taken as a criticism. It's more pointed to an area which might require another webinar or another form of information sharing.
Stephanie Bain has put a really interesting thing in the chat. She has said early intervention is a must, but how do we get those in EI services to engage? There's a real issue in schools about knowledge of ADHD. They know they need to learn more about it, but can we get them to undertake training? Nope. And I think, Stephanie, you know that I was in Shetland to do that 6 weeks ago. And it's interesting how when I was doing teaching college, we had 1 day about additional support needs. We had a 1 day training course on it. That was it. And I don't know why it's not a fundamental part of education training when, as Bill has said, did you say 35% of Scottish children have an additional support need? But we are not preparing the people who are in charge of these individuals and in charge of not only their learning but their well-being full time. So you're preaching to the choir over here, Stephanie. Absolutely.
On a training note or a skill enhancement note, can I refer to the we as an organisation, as a FITOL registered training centre, we have 6 short courses and 12 modules covering a range of different things that are all independently accredited. So if anybody's interested in those, you can get the link, or you can get the link to what they are, but not necessarily the content. Again, that's available from our website. There's lots of things available on our website, so please feel free to go to AISee Collaborative.co.uk. Yeah, and if you get any queries, just email them in and we'll be happy to answer them if we can.
Absolutely. Bill, could you maybe go to the next slide so we could look at what's coming up next? Dawn has put a very interesting thing that says it's not just for ADHD, it's also for children in schools with trauma backgrounds, empathy, structure. Yep. And in 2018, 2019, I was, what's it called when you go to another job for 2 years?
Secondment.
There you go, seconded to work on the relationship, sexual health and parenthood resource, which is at rshp.scot. And that's the first time, I think, in Scotland specifically, there has been a curriculum for this, where from early years, it's 3 to 18, where you talk about shame, you talk about feelings, you talk about emotions, because they are as important as the sexual aspects of relationship, sexual health and parenthood. But it's how often do people actually open that website? You know, some people are using resources that are older than me. Like literally, I have been in schools where they will roll out a VCR player to show a cartoon that is older than me. So I just wish we could all be on the same page a little bit more. But the fact that you guys are all here and we're all on the same page here is really, really reassuring.
Absolutely. Can I just come in on our inspirational reading list? There's an excellent set of books all around emotions, but they're ideal for I would say most children at primary school age, and they're very good for really, really good. And they lend yourself for practitioners to be adaptable. So yes, and they're not necessarily aimed at education, social work, and anyone else. They're literally just taking you through what it is, where it is, why it is. So yeah, they're well worth looking at, and you can get on the list. There's a picture of the book and a short summary of what that's about. So yes, we make no recommendations as to where people buy them from. That's entirely up to the individual. We just take them as they're submitted to us and put them on. I'll run on to this slide. We have Avoid the Disconnect seminar in the 6th of November. Yep. And that is a lot of that event is about connecting to some of the stuff that where we've got disconnects that were identified today, not necessarily the situation, but social work, education, so on and so forth, and bringing interventions together. And in particular, Bill's doing a presentation. In fact, I think we're all doing presentations in that one, are we?
Yeah.
Yep.
Clarify the date.
We've also got
Tom, the date you said there was what?
6th.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, that is correct, isn't it?
Yeah, I read it as 24th of November.
Sorry, November 24th.
2020.
Sorry. And we've got a series that we're working on now to continue for spring and summer. Now, whilst their webinars are free, they do carry Institute of Training and Occupational Learning accreditation. Unfortunately, there's an administration cost for that we have to lay out, and that is £15 per person to cover that. So if anybody's interested in those, feel free. We will make them up, we'll publish the dates, etc., as we go forward across Eventbrite, Ticket Tailored, and our own website as we go. So yeah.
Just to be avoiding the disconnect, that's a seminar about looking at some serious case reviews or learning reviews, as they're now called, and finding the common messages. So it might be of relevance to those particularly involved in the care system and education system as well. Yeah,
you're doing one on that. We've got Jean McClellan joining us, who led the independent review to Margaret Fleming, and there's some really good effective learning come out of that. And a lot of that is really about disconnecting different approaches. So that would be well worth coming for. And I'm doing a bit on a case we worked on in Australia, where we teamed up with international practice or international bodies and professional bodies to help meet that need. And I have to say that was hugely beneficial. And yeah, please feel free. It's about sharing knowledge and understanding.
We're about to run out. Can I thank the participants for not heckling me, and bear in mind that it's 20 degrees out where I am at the moment, so you may want to put something negative in your feedback forms about resenting the fact that you're still in Scotland and I'm in Spain. I don't know.
And Bill, thank you so much for leading this. Thank you for giving us such a depth of expertise and knowledge. Thank you, Tom, for helping bring this all together and really form it. I mean, Tom is very much I nearly said the boss, but that's not true. But you're the leader.
What did you say? What did you say there?
The boss. You're not my boss. But you know, you are very much the one who's been leading this. You're the one who's been spending a lot of time in this. So we really, really appreciate all of the time and effort. It's been a long time.
It's really about filling gaps, because there's one thing that we as a team are really good at is listening to what is being said and picking up on it and trying to address issues. So yeah, it's really, that's what it's about, and as an organisation, that's what we're about. And I'd like to thank those as well that are also now starting to send comments in via WhatsApp. So that's really good as well. We'll transfer them onto the stuff that we send out as well. But feel free, you know where we are. If you think we've got something that to offer you, then please get in touch.
Okay.
Thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you,
everybody.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.